Hey, this is Jacob Evan. Thanks for tuning in. And in this video, we will consider the subject of tradition, especially traditions about the law and traditions within future community. And I want to consider this in a more nuanced way rather than just saying that traditions are all bad, because I think that view may actually cause a bit of a blind spot on the issue. Therefore, it is important that we think this through and that we think about what defines a tradition and whether or not all traditions are truly bad, and that we recognize how traditions are created because certain practices we do today, without thinking about it in that way, are unintentionally turning into traditions for future generations. So clearly traditions are a problem whenever they are adding to the law. They are a problem whenever they are causing us to observe in a way which is contrary to the law. This is well accepted in most of our Torah-focused circles today, and most of us recognize that with the enactments of the rabbis. But tradition can go beyond those obvious points. Before, whenever people would use the word tradition, I didn't necessarily have an allergic response to that word, but I certainly had a negative association with the idea of tradition. And it would automatically bring up thoughts about the rabbinic traditions or the pagan holidays or similar problem traditions. However, I had an interaction several months ago that caused me to think a bit more about this. I was talking with someone that said he was developing his own traditions. At first, this seemed like something bad must be going on, and so I asked him a few more questions to better understand what he meant, and I found out that he was just figuring out how he was going to observe. He was just figuring out how he was going to understand certain commands, how he was going to implement them, how he was going to worship, basically just what he was going to do as his practice. And that is what he was referring to as traditions, as his traditions he was developing. And I can understand how that would be a valid way to think about it. Now, everyone has their own personal definition for what defines tradition, and I want us to consider how much broader this could be. If we think about things in that way, in the way of observance or just accepted ways that things are being done, clearly this is much broader than rabbinic Judaism alone. There are also traditions that exist within smaller groups. There are traditions that exist within families, whether it be the way that prayers are done, the regular readings that are done, or the translation that is normally used. And there are traditions that a single individual will follow for himself, even if you are able to step out of them at times and see them for what they really are and recognize they're not actually commands themselves. In some ways, traditions of some sort will always exist, whether we call them traditions or not. And very often an individual may take part in the traditions of a group, even a group that they don't technically belong to, or even in the case that there is no obvious group, that we will draw upon effectively traditions of others. And I have some questions that I think we should start thinking about. Are there not elements of tradition in simply having an accepted observance of a command? Is an accepted understanding of a command, an accepted translation, an accepted practice of a command? Is that not similar to a tradition? And an important question on that point is going to be, what is the difference between a tradition and adding to the law? Or at what point does a tradition start to become adding to the law? And as we are continuing to mull that over, and even after having our immediate response, giving that question further thought, while we are doing that, I want to raise a few other matters that could relate to this. One of those issues is community and the nature of community. And when I'm using this word community right now, I am defining that very broadly. A community could be anything from a major group with thousands of members. It could also be a smaller group of people who meet online on Shabbat to talk about the Torah like our group does. Our group that's associated with the channel, and I have a previous video on how to join those meetings. Community could include that, and community could be as loose as an individual who has never really had any interaction with anyone else in that community, quote unquote. as with many people who regularly listen to this channel at the same time that others are listening, even if those people have yet to take any effort to interact with each other. There are a number of ways that community can appear. And a fact of any community, a fact of any group that involves more than just a few people, is that there are some people who will be more aware and some people who are less aware. Some people have only been in this for a matter of months or maybe even weeks or days. And I think it's far better for new people to realize that they want to follow it and to encourage that rather than demanding some sort of full awareness before a person makes that decision to observe. Would we prefer someone coming into it and just continuing to learn like we are all doing, hopefully anyway? Or would we prefer someone spending years in the sidelines knowing that it is the right thing to do, but just getting into this habit of not taking action? I think that making the choice to follow it and continuing to learn is the best choice for all of us to make, regardless of how aware we may think we are. And when it comes to the issue of lack of awareness, I also know that some people believe that they are incapable of becoming aware. And we are probably all, to some degree, just delegating some of our thinking to someone else, and we can see how that has been bad in some cases, and we can also see how that would actually be better for some people if they would simply do that instead of using their own judgment. We know it is not always the case that the person thinking for themselves will automatically arrive at the truth, and inevitably that person will rely on alternate traditions or more recently developed traditions in the process, either way. And in the future, because I'm thinking about the period of time between now and the restoration of Israel described in Deuteronomy 30, because I'm thinking about the time between now and then, I expect it will probably be pretty prevalent in the future, that there will be a lot of people breaking away from long-held beliefs, and they will just want guidance. They will want to know what to do. And when we accept that, we start to see how tricky this becomes, even when we are just trying to promote the written Torah. Because people are learning from the traditions within the group, or learning from your traditions. People will want to know, how do I do this? How do I observe this? Does this command apply to this situation? Or does this situation relate to any command? And they will expect you to have some sort of answer for that. And even if we are doing our best to try to always tie it to the text of the Torah, to some specific statement in the Torah, there will inevitably be some contamination with our personal opinions, our personal traditions, or the traditions that we have received from some other source. We can say that the Torah is written plainly, and perhaps it was for the people at the time it was written, but in some ways we are so distant from it today and distant from the language of that time now that it becomes more complicated than it was. For example, there are Hebrew words that today we would have no knowledge of the meaning without either the traditional translations, such as the versions, the early translations, or without some early commentary on a verse, or an instance of a similar word in a related language. And even then, that is not proof of the meaning of the word. It is just a tradition, and a tradition which is relied upon. So those traditions are often relied upon, and most people are unaware that it is a tradition. So a person very well may think they are trying to avoid all traditions, are just trying to read the text of the Torah through a translation, and then follow only the text of the command. And yet some of the words may be translated purely because of a tradition. And likewise, a person may try to delve into lexicons or dictionaries, and those resources themselves may serve as traditions depending upon how much we believe them. And we might say that maybe we're just going to distrust everything, that we're just going to pray for God to reveal it, and then just try to use our personal judgment. And so while I'll refer to the one part later, with regard to trying to use our own judgment, where is the judgment coming from? What is it based upon? There is a tradition that the popular view is always wrong. And this is a popular view within our own circles. And that may be useful sometimes to have that view, and maybe it's not so useful other times. Likewise, our common sense is often just what we call traditional ways of thinking, which were taught to us by our families when we were children, or by our culture, and our personal beliefs, which we may be using to make a judgment, even more so personal feelings. And even just the behaviors of the community or the habits of an individual will eventually set a standard for what seems to be right and wrong, for what emotionally feels like right and wrong. And this can manifest as a stated tradition in the future, the thing you should do, the thing you shouldn't do, because of people learning from your peers in a group. The emotional mind has very little awareness of the text of the commands. And we know this because most of us have observed Christians stating that they feel no compulsion to follow God's commands, or that they have prayed about what to do and they feel no conviction to stop breaking God's commands. So a feeling isn't automatically from God or from the law, and there are often feelings from the group or groups we are associated with. I have felt feelings to go toward a particular belief, even despite my own study of it, just because of the people involved. Other people having that view that I did not come to myself. The only way that, with all of this, that there would be a reliable connection to the law itself is just because people in the community are being overly mindful of preventing traditions which are against the law, or preventing any tradition that could be confused with the law, and by encouraging traditions of actually observing the law. And so going back to this question about what is the difference between traditions and adding to the law, I think these issues highlight the need to watch out for what is becoming tradition under our nose, because tradition is inevitable. Certainly, if we want to avoid adding to the law, the goal is to pay as much attention to the text as possible. The less we add to the law, the less we impose upon the law, the less we tell ourselves that this passage says this, this other passage says this, therefore I am going to conclude something which is not actually laid out in the Torah. The less we tell people what the reason for some command is, even though the text doesn't say any such thing, and we're really just guessing or assuming, the less we do all of those things, the better the likelihood that our traditions will point to the law. And maybe a useful tradition would be to simply accept that we are continuing to learn, we are continuing to work on understanding and refining our understanding, and our traditions don't just affect us now, they will affect others in the future.